Donald L. Miller is the John Henry MacCracken Professor of History Emeritus at Lafayette College and author of 10 books, including City of the Century, The Epic of Chicago and the Making of America, Lewis Mumford, A Life, a New York Times notable book, and the critically acclaimed bestseller Masters of the Air, which is currently being made into a television series by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. Miller has co-hosted, co-produced, or served as a historical consultant for more than 30 television documentaries and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications. The book that we will be discussing this evening is Vicksburg, Grant's Campaign That Broke the Confederacy, which has won, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Miller, but 4 awards. The Civil War Roundtable of New York's Fletcher Pratt Literary Award, the 2019 Army Historical Foundation Distinguished Writing Award for Battle History, and the 25th Annual Daniel M. and Marilyn W. Laney Book Prize awarded by the Austin Civil War Roundtable Incorporated, to just name a few of the awards. Also joining us this evening is James Onorevole, who was civil engineering class of 17 and history class of 2019, graduate of Lafayette College. James currently works as a civil design engineer at NV5 in Parsippany, New Jersey. However, he's looking to transition to a career in history by way of a new job or graduate school. As a student, James served as the president of History Club, an officer of the Lafayette Environmental Awareness Protection, and an officer of the Newman Association. James met Dr. Miller in 2013 in his first year seminar class, A War Within a War, a class that focused on Dr. Miller's book, Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany. In later semesters, James enrolled in Dr. Miller's classes, Slavery in the Civil War and seminar on America in the 20s and 30s. In the spring of 2015, James studied abroad in Bremen, Germany. Before his senior year, James was asked to become one of Dr. Miller's Excel scholars to assist with the research for the Vicksburg book, and an HBO series based on Masters of the Air. James has also done historical research for Lou Rita Productions in Easton, PA, and historic Bethlehem museums and sites. So, with all of that, I will turn it over to Dr. Miller and James.
Great, thank you so much, Janine. I think I can speak for Dr. Miller and I that we're both so happy to have so many people here to learn more about Vicksburg and Dr. Miller's process. So Dr. Miller, I guess what I'd like to start out in this interview, I'd like to start out with your overall background as a historian. So you're a lauded historian, a New York Times bestselling author. You've worked with some of the biggest names in the business, as we've heard in your introduction. And yet, mostly you've been focused on the American cities, the American cities of American history, and World War II. This is your first book on the Civil War. Why the shift and why Vicksburg?
Well, I took a Civil War course in graduate school. I ordered it from a really great Civil War historian by the name of Avery Craven. And he was a sensational lecturer. And I just didn't have time. I was in a thing called pretentiously called intellectual history. I wasn't interested in military history. I didn't take any courses in that. It was mostly histories of ideas. Sailing along, and I caught that Ken Burns series, and he put the hook in me. And I was curious, you know, it was magnificently done, and I got to become friends with Ken and did some films with him later, and I still think this is his supreme effort. And I was curious, though, when they got to Vicksburg, they really skipped by it. Ken skipped by it very quickly, and I gave him a call, and he said, well, we didn't have the kind of images. There weren't enough sketch artists at Vicksburg, and there weren't as many as there were, say, at Gettysburg. And so I checked into it, and he was wrong. And so, and I thought, I did a little reading on Vicksburg, but and saw that, you know, it's a battle of immense importance. And I had been taking students to Gettysburg every year. We did you do the Civil War, the Gettysburg trip in our class?
I wasn't involved in that.
Oh,
Not
okay.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was taking kids to, beginning, in the late 90s down to Gettysburg. And we did a whole week almost on Gettysburg. We did Killer Angels and things. And so I hadn't done a lot of reading on Vicksburg. I began reading on it, became interested in it. And then, there's always something to get you about a place. And you have to see it first. I went down there. I was curious before I'd actually done a lot of reading. And you have this commanding city sitting on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. You got this immense swamp, the Mississippi Delta extending from Vicksburg all the way up to Memphis. You got the powerful mile-wide Mississippi itself, this really jungle-like terrain that surrounds Vicksburg. And because it's a lightly developed place, you get a feel for the battlefield. And the battlefield is not overrun like Gettysburg, nor surrounded by McDonald's and, chicken this and chicken that. And so you really get the ambiance of the place walking around it. And while I was there, fortuitously, I ran into this guy named Ed Bars, who's a real Civil War warhorse. I mean, Ed's published 100 books and all that sort of stuff. He's a veteran of this Marine veteran of the South Pacific. And he's been a park ranger at Vicksburg, park ranger at Gettysburg, national park ranger. And he'd written a 3-volume history on Vicksburg. It's not a great book, but it's complete. It's a bullet by bullet account. Kind of need a couple of aspirin bottles to get through it. But it's comprehensive. And if you want to know the battlefield, Ed's the guy. So he asked me what I was doing down there because he'd read a couple of my other books. And I told him, and he's like, let me give you a tour of the battlefield. So I got a personal tour, and he's known as probably the best tour guide of the last century, and you could feel the bullets whizzing around your ears, And we spent a whole day together, and we were joined by his buddy, a guy named Warren Graybow, who's a geographer and works at the Army Corps of Engineers. And he was working on a geographic history of the area. So that gave me I'm always interested in geography and the way armies or cities change nature and nature changes cities and armies. The interaction of the two. And he was terrific. He kept saying as we went around the battlefield, battles aren't fought on pool tables. It's not flat land you're talking about. There's hills, terrain, there's everything to consider. And when we were done, Ed said, hey, let's grab a beer. So we went and had a beer. And gotta remember, I just met Ed. And Ed said, Miller, you know why you're gonna write the best book on Vicksburg? And I said, no, I don't know why. And he said, because you don't know a damn thing about it. And I said, oh, okay, that's true in and of itself, but why is that important? He said, well, we're laboring here in the forest, and we're not seeing the forest for the trees. And you're coming in from the outside, you've changed, you've done books on different things, you haven't been a specialist in any one thing. Ed used to define a specialist, which he was one actually, as a person who knows more and more about less and less. And he said, maybe you'll bring a fresh perspective. So those were words of encouragement, and went back home and decided I'm going to go down there and really look into it. So I spent a month and rented a boat, got back into the bayous and these serpentine little streams north of Vicksburg. Wanted to get it because the Navy was so important in the Battle of Vicksburg and the waterways around Vicksburg. Grant controlled those waterways, and that allowed him to control the battlefield, as it were. And without the Navy, as he says in an autobiography, he had never even attempted to take Vicksburg. And I rented a Jeep, drove all the way up to the northernmost areas of the campaign. This is a hell of a campaign. It stretches for 1,000 miles up and down the river. Even further than that, if you go to where Grant started at Cairo, Illinois, and you go all the way down to New Orleans. And that's where I began to see some of the fallacies of or shortcomings, I should say, not fallacies, of the previous book. They don't take in the whole Mississippi Valley theater. And that's what I really wanted to do, because that's what Grant was up to. When he became a brigadier general for the first time, and he read about this in the newspaper that he was promoted, he didn't know he's promoted. He wanted to use the rivers of the South, the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River, the Mississippi River, which had been blocked off by forts that the Southerners had built along these rivers, where they're seeing them rivers as defensive installations. Grant saw them as corridors of invasion. And where he was stationed at a place called Cairo, Illinois, which is in the southernmost area of Illinois, pointing like a spear point toward New Orleans and Vicksburg. They were introducing for the first time ironclad gunboats, and they had a very, aggressive commander in the area, Andrew Foote. Grant teamed up with him. And his first experience really as a general is as a river warrior. He takes Fort Henry's in Donelson and goes down to Forts Henry and Donelson on the Kentucky and Cumberland rivers, uses the Tennessee River to go down all the way to Shiloh. Same time, Foote's going down the Mississippi. So, I'm thinking to myself, this is a much bigger thing than just the Battle of Vicksburg. And then I go down to New Orleans, where I'm a member of the presidential counselors, and I visit regularly. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, New Orleans was liberated as part of the Vicksburg campaign. It was a Navy that was first interested in taking Vicksburg. And they brought these big saltwater ships under Admiral Farragut, one of the most famous commanders in American history. They brought them up from the Gulf, through the narrow straits below New Orleans, and they captured the city from below. All the defenses at New Orleans expected the gunboats to be coming down from Cairo. He came in the back door and captured New Orleans in a day. So the Union has captured the largest cotton port and slave market in the country, but they went upriver, and without opposition, they take Baton Rouge, they take Natchez, and they get to Vicksburg, and both these towns surrender, without fighting, and sensing the power of these enormous, frigates. And Vicksburg stubbornly refuses to surrender. That surprised them, because Vicksburg had voted against secession, and a lot of Yankees in the town. But so when they refuse to surrender, Farragut decides to bombard them. And he fails at that because he can't raise his guns far enough, and he's very worried about his ships going aground in the narrow points on the Mississippi and the shoals. He calls in the ironclad gunboats. They can sail on mist, literally. They have almost no displacement. And we bring this big ironclad fleet down there that meets the Gulf fleet. And for 2 months, they bombard the city incessantly. But they don't have a landing force because the Army won't cooperate. Grant at the time is in Tennessee with Sherman, and they're already have collaborated. But they're under a commander that's obstinate about them staying in Tennessee on garrison duty, guarding places that have already been taken. And Grant and Sherman are urging him to release them. And if they had done that in 1862, they'd have captured Vicksburg and lost maybe 100 guys. But the Navy gives up. Disease also absolutely decimated the fleet. They went down there in the summer season, and you're fighting the terrain down there, but you're also fighting the climate. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid, and thank God they didn't get it, yellow fever. So I see this thing as a gigantic theater campaign. But in conclusion to your question, by January of 1863, think of the date. That's when January 1st, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which makes the Union Army an army of liberation, okay? Lincoln can't free slaves in states. Slavery is a state policy. He can free them through military emancipation. So Grant arrives there right at that propitious moment, but everything's going wrong for the Union. They lost the Battle of Fredericksburg. The Republican Party took a beating in the '62 elections. Grant had already tried to take Vicksburg the month before with Sherman and failed. And now he's going down again. And at that point, Vicksburg is the only obstacle in a little place just south of it called Port Hudson. They are the only obstacles to complete Union control of that river. And if the North can take it, the Mississippi becomes a Yankee River. And that's why Vicksburg is so important at that propitious moment in American history. So in '63, it's the most important point in the Confederacy. Because you control that river, you can control the whole Western theater. You can move into Alabama, into Georgia, as Sherman did, into Tennessee, as Grant did later on at Chattanooga and whatnot. Long answer there, brother. You're used to those in class.
Well, so I guess to summarize, that you were definitely taken with the geographical challenges and significance of the area.
Yeah.
And really piqued your interest in the campaign as a whole. And one other thing that you credit, though, in the author's note of the book is William Faulkner's novel Absalom, Absalom, as shaping your vision. How did that play in conjunction with all of these other factors you mentioned?
Well, to get to this like in a 1, 2, 3 thing, you first see the site for me. I mean, you gotta become transfixed by the site, because you're going to spend 4 years of your life on this book. It better be interesting to you, and you want to write a book that you'd want to read. And so you go to the archives, and we'll come back to that. And after I'd done a lot of archival research, and I did a total of 51 archives from USC out on the West Coast, all the way to, West Point, New York. When you do that kind of research, you come across unexpected things. And what I came across was that what struck me was the newness of Vicksburg. The book Absalom, Absalom by Faulkner, you mentioned, was published at the same time as Gone with the Wind, with these visions of these beautiful women with silken dresses on the porch, and the colonnades, and these big white mansions, and slaves in the fields, and things, and everything's harmonious, and the slaves are getting along with the master, things like that. Well, this is what we used to call the Ulrich Phillips view of slavery, the old romantic view of slavery. And Faulkner catches, I think, what Mississippi was really like: wild frontier country. It is the American frontier. It's the West. It's the South, but it's also the West. And the kind of people who go there are young people like Jefferson Davis and his brother Joe Davis, who helped to open the area. Both came as very young men and helped to make the state. And they went into an area called the Delta, and they started to cut out the Delta. And the Delta is an inhospitable, mosquito-ridden area. It is. I was reading another book at the time, Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, and that's what I thought, And I thought of the film too, going up with Colonel Kurtz, and the film in Vietnam. But and I kept thinking, this novel is really about Vicksburg, although it's not quite set in Vicksburg. To give you a 30-second synopsis, this guy, Thomas Sutpen, it's 1833, and he comes to Mississippi, to Jefferson, Mississippi, which is really Oxford, Mississippi. That's where Faulkner's from. And he's unknown. He's a stranger. And he rides John Wayne style down the, dirt track that leads through the town. He has 4 slaves following him, okay? And he has saddlebags filled with everything he has, all his possessions. And he has enough money to buy land outside of town. He buys the land, and it's in a marshy area. He and the slaves strip naked every day, cover themselves with clay to beat off the mosquitoes, and go neck deep into the swamp, pulling out, fallen timber, and using clay to hold bricks together. And he builds what's called a mansion. It's just a big ramshackle home. No white columns or anything like that. And when it's finished, he puts a chandelier in, he puts doorknobs on, he puts rugs in, he buys paintings, he sends his slaves to the Mississippi to pick up furniture. And then he goes into town and he marries a young woman, and she becomes the plantation mistress, and he becomes part of the Mississippi slaveocracy, a slave-owning grandee. And I thought to myself, slavery came to Mississippi that suddenly, and what happened in Jefferson County in this novel happened in Vicksburg. It happened in the Yazoo area I just described above Vicksburg. The climate, the terrain, everything was just exactly the same. And the death rate was extremely high for slaves as well as white masters. Only 97% of the population was Black, all of them slaves. It was really the roughest form of slavery imaginable. And Sutton goes to war then in the novel, and Grant's not in the novel, by the way. He goes to war. When he comes back, this empire, this slave empire, and he extended his lands and built other plantations, is all gone. His sons are dead. Slavery's dead in Mississippi. King Cotton's gone. And he has to start all over again. And that's pretty much what happened when Grant came into Mississippi. I mean, 2 years before he first arrived in Mississippi in 1862, a year before Sutton went to war. And 2 years before that, he was shelving goods in a hardware store owned by his father, a degrading job in Galena, a little lead town on the Mississippi in Illinois. And before that, he had been driven out of the Army because he was caught drinking on payday while he was a paymaster. And he resigned from the Army in disgrace, never made it at anything, failed at everything he did, farming, insurance, real estate, you name it, just like Sherman did. And then in desperation goes to his father, and his father, instead of making him manager of the store, turns him into a clerk. Well, that's one of the great, you need great characters to a book. You got to have great characters, and there's no more interesting character than Grant. I mean, he's the hardware clerk in 61 when the war breaks out. 62, he wins the biggest victory of the Civil War for the North at that time, at Fort Donelson in Tennessee. Unconditional surrender, he demands, and gets that name, U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Captures an entire army, first time it done in the Civil War. Grant will do it 2 more times. Nobody else did that. Next year, captures Vicksburg. Next year, he goes east and he beats Robert E. Lee and meets him in the wilderness in that long campaign down to Richmond. And the following year, he takes Lee's surrender. The war is over. And 4 years later, he's president of the United States. So you got 8 years between the hardware store and the White House. That's a pretty meteoric rise. I don't know if there's anything like it in American history. And he's the most capable general in our history, probably, maybe with the exception of Washington. Of course, I'll get a lot of people with Lee in here, but I'm going to stick with Grant. And he was a pretty capable president as well, maligned for years, but now as we find out more about him, he's the guy who broke the Ku Klux Klan, appointed more Jewish Americans to administrative positions than any president up to this point in history, and did a lot of good things. Wasn't a great president, but he's a competent president.
Sure.
So that's Sutton. And I thought to myself, what I got to do, in addition to doing the geography and the big theater stuff, I've got to get this liberation story in there. Mm-hmm. And that's what spins me back to the archives, because when you go in the archives, you discover things that are unexpected. And that's the fun of research. You have your mind made up about a lot of things before you write. And writing a good book is about getting your mind changed by the evidence. And I just found an awful lot of evidence to the fact that Grant freed up to 100,000 slaves in the Mississippi Valley during the Vicksburg campaign, 100,000 slaves. And he put over 21,000 of them in Union Blue as Yankee soldiers. And he took over plantations, including Jefferson Davis's plantation. And he turned Davis's plantation, like he did other plantations, into what he called a Negro paradise. Put the slaves to work under Army supervision and paid them wages. And they were renting the land, they didn't own it, but they were self-sufficient. And they ran their own community, had their own courts and everything else. And he also used the Black troops to guard the plantations against Klan-style guerrillas and things like that. And he's doing this at the same time he's waging the major military campaign of the Civil War. So he's a military general and by accident, a liberator as well, because he had no intention. He doesn't start the war as an abolitionist. He had no interest in slavery. He joins, like most Americans did, he joined to save the Union, to redeem the Union, to expunge the Confederacy. Slowly, though, he becomes an abolitionist because of military necessity. He begins to see, like his troops did, and the archives show this. I'm reading things from guys, and they took the lead rather than Grant. These young kids from Illinois, Michigan, and that's where most of Grant's soldiers came from, the Midwest. These Illinois, Iowa boys go in there, and a lot of them are hardened racist, absolutely hardened racist. And they come to believe, and they explain this to their parents, that they'll write letters like, hey, Pa, you may not like this, but I've become a kind of a military abolitionist. I think we ought to free these slaves because they're producing cotton in the fields, and the South is selling these cotton and using it to buy guns to kill us. They're also building fortifications, and we're fighting against those fortifications. They're building ships and shipyards in these small rivers and things like that. And also, if we start to free the slaves, a lot of Confederate soldiers will desert and come back to protect their families against what they think might be a slave revolution, or just to keep the family farm going. So every slave we take is a step toward victory. So they saw the military necessity. And a lot of these slaves, unfortunately, that were liberated were treated as badly or worse behind Union lines as they were by the Southerners. But the minute they stepped into a Union camp, they were free. They were free forever. And Grant gets the support of Lincoln for this policy. He has too many blacks in his, he has an army of about 60,000 when he goes into Mississippi, and he's got 40,000 slaves intermixed with it. What am I going to do with them? I can't run a campaign. So that's when he starts to set up these farms run by the slaves themselves. And he appoints missionaries and chaplains and social workers from the North, men and women. And my book has almost as many women characters as men, to run these places. So everywhere he goes, he gains territory. And when he gains territory, he holds it by taking over these plantations. He didn't have to oust the Confederates. Wherever Grant appeared, there was a mass panic migration. And Mississippians and Louisianans were hurrying as fast as they could to Alabama and Texas with their slaves if they were in good health. Older slaves, very young slaves, pregnant women were left behind and to starve. And a lot of those people found their way to Grant's army. And I don't want to create the impression that I'm trying to dispel two things, that Lincoln waves a wand called the Emancipation Proclamation, all these slaves are free. That's bullshit. What you really have happen here is Grant has to, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't, Southerners laughed at it. They laughed at it until Grant showed up on their front lawn. And then when Grant shows up on their front lawn, he takes their slaves. But slaves also, it wasn't just Lincoln and Grant that free the slaves. Slaves free themselves because they take enormous risks. There's slave patrols, Klan-style slave patrols. Every county you had to, it's like a national militia, or state militia, local militia. You had to join the local guard force, and you had to patrol the plantations and search and bring back runaway slaves. You had the hound dogs and things like that. So they took risks, and they followed Grant's armies for all kinds of reasons. Some of them were just scared. One commander asked him, so you came to us to be free? She said, no, I came because I'm hungry. And so for a variety of reasons, slaves flee to Grant's army. And so what you have in addition to a military victory at Vicksburg is the beginning of the end of plantation slavery in the third largest slaveholding state in the country, and Louisiana as well, across the river.
Absolutely.
So
I'd like to,
all of a sudden it becomes a different book for me.
yeah,
And it did because I found these soldier letters because Grant, see, I have to make this point, Grant doesn't want them initially out stealing slaves, as they called it, because that breaks down Army discipline. In the winter of 1862, he's ready to invade Mississippi from the north, from the land side, from Tennessee. And he and Sherman want a disciplined, cohesive army marching in regular fashion. And if he has these guys pillaging and destroying rebel property and stealing slaves, the discipline breaks down. But they were unable to maintain the discipline. So the pillaging took place on a massive scale. Plantations going up in smoke. And the liberation of slaves went on at a very fast pace. Yeah. So it's a hell of a story, really. It's not just I always call myself a historian of war rather than military historian. Military history is about tactics, company B's here, company C's. I mean, you got to get that stuff in there. You get the generals, get the battles. I mean, hell, I can't see why people shy away from military history. We became the United States because of a war. It's called the American Revolution. We saved the country because of a war. It's called the Civil War. And we saved ourselves as a democracy because of a war called World War II. So sometimes war is necessary and it shapes the country. But that's what's happening in Mississippi. This is the only social revolution in American history.
Yeah.
And like the French Revolution, the bottom up.
And it seems that
surprised me. That surprised me. I didn't know my book was going to go in that direction. Never thought of it.
it seems what really separates you from the other, military historians of war, is the approach you've taken to writing history, relying on the narratives that you've already touched upon to a certain extent, and creating characters, in a sense, out of Grant and Sherman, and also locations like Cairo and Vicksburg. I guess what brought you to that style in the beginning, and
I read a lot of fiction.
What do you think
I've
makes
always
it
read
effective?
I've always read a lot of fiction.
Yeah.
My mother was a great reader. My father was a great reader. My whole family are great readers. And we didn't have a lot of money, but everybody read books. And I was disappointed in a lot of the history I first read. I did not major in history as an undergraduate. I majored in philosophy. And I was going to go out and open a philosophy shop, right? What are you going to do with it? Went to grad school and Maryland and finished up at Yale. But I thought, why do history books have to be so goddamn boring? So many of them, And then, well, they aren't all that way. I read Alan Nevins, for example, who I think is the best of all the Civil War historians, wrote this magnificent 8-volume thing on the coming of the war and Reconstruction. And I found it in the library at Yale, and I read it in my room. And you weren't supposed to do that. You were supposed to read, we learned history through historiography, what historians said about things, and rather than what actually happened. And I love biography too, and I never encountered a biography in a graduate class. Crazy. And I thought, what I try to do in my books is I try to use the techniques of a novelist. I want narration. I take pride in calling myself a storyteller. A lot of historians say, well, you're a popularizer. Well, I hope to be a popularizer. I want to sell a lot of books.
No shame in that.
I want to be popular, and I want to make a lot of money, and I want to influence people, and I want to out-research all the other guys that are just doing their nerdy little scholarly stuff, And I want to have a book that has tension, momentum, drama, intrigue, suspense, all the sort of stuff, great characters, all the sort of stuff, great terrain, picturesque stuff, majestic stuff, all the stuff that I would find in compelling fiction. And then I read a lot of Barbara Tuchman, Guns of August and things like that. And she writes like that. And David McCullough writes like that. And he became a very close friend. In fact, I brought him a couple times up to Lafayette. The last time he came up, of course, as a commencement speaker. And but before that, his son was here as an undergraduate, and he came up and I paid him $50 and he slept on my couch. I think we paid him $20,000 for the commencement. Of course, that was 10 years later and 2 Pulitzer Prizes later. But David's always been an inspiration for me, David McCullough, the way he writes. And so I always put a thing a little, this isn't some hokey little thing. I do put a thing over my little tab over my typewriter or computer, and it says, will the reader turn the next page? You got to keep the thing moving. And the hardest thing for me to do in narrative history is to build the interpretation into the story without disrupting the flow of the story and saying, stop, and I'll tell you the significance of this. Tuchman has a great remark in her book. She says, if you tell the story right, it'll sneak up to you and tap you on the shoulder and say, here I am, I'm the interpretation. If you do it through organization, then the reader sees this unfolding. He sees, or she sees, the transitions when the colonists start to win, when they get the support of the French in the Revolutionary War and the French fleet, things. You start to see that. You don't have to beat somebody over the head with it or tell somebody what 18 historians have to say about it. So those are the kind of things I try to bring into my books. Yeah.
So let's take a dive into some of these characters that you've laid out for us. You already set the scene in the very beginning with Grant in Cairo. He's kind of just setting up shop there. He's not really on the move yet. And then you flash down in part 2 to David Farragut coming up from the south up the Mississippi. It seems that early on in this campaign, the Confederates make a grave miscalculation with the importance of New Orleans.
They did. They didn't guard it well enough. As I said, they expected the invasion to come from north to south down the river. And we had blockaded the South with big saltwater ships. And the saltwater Navy, as opposed to what I call the brownwater Navy, the inland Navy. That inland Navy is a Navy that Grant used, okay, which they could go in shallow water. But Farragut's big fleet couldn't. And the South thought, no way they can get through those passes below New Orleans. And there were 2 immense forts down there too. And Farragut had to pass the forts. He got by them. So with the defenses pointing north, they had to turn everything around. They were building a couple of big gunboats in New Orleans. They didn't have them ready yet. Most of the soldiers that had enlisted to fight for the South from New Orleans were fighting north at Corinth and other places north of New Orleans. And so Farragut literally wins it without a fight. It's just a show of force. He demands the surrender of the city. They hold out for 3 days. And then he said, how about this? I'm going to flatten the city with my fleet. And they surrendered at that point. And somebody tore down the American flag from the post office. He found out who it was and he hanged him inside the post office. A little signal about what opposition meant. And then went upriver to get Vicksburg. Yeah. So that's the seagoing part of the story. And then his brother, his foster brother, is a big star in the second part of my book. And David Dixon Porter, who commanded the ironclads on the Mississippi. And he is working hand in glove with Sherman. It's a triumvirate, Sherman and Grant and Porter, who really take down Vicksburg. And when they're shelling it, for example, during the siege, Vicksburg is shelling the city from the river and Grant shelling it from the land side. And he even took his ironclads Porter did, up into the Delta above Vicksburg to try to get in behind the city. but we'll get into that later in a sense of how geographically situated Vicksburg was. It seemed to be, to a lot of eyes, including Grant's initial scouts, impregnable, untakeable because of its geography. And Porter helped to defeat the geography.
And in some ways, the geography is yet another character that you really manipulate and have Grant and Farragut and all the leaders grapple with.
Yeah, and climate. I mean, when there's a woman named Mary Livermore, she's a relief worker. She's coming down with bandages and fruit and letters for the soldiers from Chicago. She's part of a whole tens of thousands of women workers across the North held these things called sanitary fairs, and to buy bandages and medicine and needed things to kill scurvy and things like that, lemons, limes, to bring them to the troops right to the front. And when Mary Livermore has one of the great, I think, autobiographies of the 19th century, she comes downriver and she sees Vicksburg for the first time. She's sailing down to Vicksburg, and what she sees are coffins floating in the river, many of them open, and the bodies of soldiers floating down the stream. What's going on? And what was going on in this situation was these guys this is the Valley Forge, if you will, of the Civil War. This is December and it was January and February of 1863. And this whole area, Grant's camps are in Louisiana, and it's cold. There's snow and ice, even in Mississippi there, and disease breaks out in the camps. And these guys are dying like flies. And the river overflows and floods the camps, Grant's camps. So the guys go high up on the levees, these high earthen levees that have been used for 2 centuries to hold back the Mississippi. And that's where they put their encampments. But they bury their dead there. And that's what was happening. When the river became so high, it crashed against these levees. It tore open the levees, tore open the coffins, and put them down in the stream. And one of her companions, several weeks later, experienced a similar scene. She was in Vicksburg working on handing out bandages and things like that, and she heard some cheering along the shoreline. Her aid station was right along the river, and she went out to see what was going on. And these soldiers were cheering. A boat was coming in with a barge behind it, and the boat was filled with coffins. And these guys were thinking and started talking among themselves, hey, we're going to die soon. Everybody's dying here. And we'll have a decent burial. And we'll have a coffin and a ceremony and things like that. And we won't just be buried in a dirty old army blanket. But that's how bad the situation was initially for Grant at Vicksburg, with just overcoming sickness and disease and getting that army in shape to march. Then he's got to try to think about, how the hell am I going to get the army? He's in Louisiana. That's where his camps are. How am I going to get my army over a mile-wide river and take a city that sits on high bluffs and has 18 miles of guns, cannon, aimed at the river? How am I going to do that? And he did all kinds of weird things. He said, I got to get below Vicksburg. I got to get on dry land. I can't take it straight on. I can't go through the Yazoo Delta, the swamps. I sent my scouts in there. They said, you can't get through there. Oh, he'd later try that, actually. How am I going to get below Vicksburg and past those batteries? And eventually he does. And Porter makes the decision. He's a Navy commander who doesn't have to take orders from Grant. He's self-sufficient, but he agrees to cooperate with Grant, and he takes his gunboats and stocks them with all kinds of provisions for soldiers, and he gets them by the Vicksburg guns. And the army, meanwhile, had been unable to march south through Louisiana to get below Vicksburg and then cross because Louisiana was flooded completely. Entire town's underwater. The floods receded. He's like Noah waiting for the water to drop, Grant. and the water drops, the army marches. Will the gunboats get by? They get by. They get below. Now he can use the gunboats to carry his army over the river from Louisiana to Mississippi. And in 3 weeks, he's in Vicksburg. And one of the great, blitzkrieg, lightning fast campaigns of the war. So, but he even took the ironclads, as big as they were, in desperation into the swamps. Lincoln went crazy. He ordered them out of the swamps, get back on the river. Grant disobeyed orders, sent Sherman in there with Porter, with 5 of the best gunboats they had. See, the Confederates didn't have these gigantic ironclad gunboats. They had a few at the beginning of the war, but not in '63. And they go through these narrow, twisting, backwater streams. The area is infested with guerrillas and things like it. And they get trapped. They get caught by reeds at the bottom, on the bottom. And their rudders get caught. And they get surrounded by guerrillas and cavalry patrols. And they almost captured, the rebels did. They almost captured Porter, and they almost captured his 5 gunboats. Sherman got there just in time. He was part of a rescue mission. He marched his troops. The troops marched through the swamps and water up to their necks. The drummer boys had to put their drums over their heads. And the men put candles in the barrels of their rifles so they could see at night. And he got there just in time, just as Porter was ready to surrender the boats and blow them up, rather, and race for the swamps and try to get away. Porter was standing on the deck, and 3 men were with him, and all 3 were shot. 1 was killed. And that's at the point Sherman arrives. Ta-da, it's over. They, disperse the guerrilla bands, and they have to back out. It took them a week to back out. They couldn't turn around. The stream was too narrow. They backed out of there. So that's how desperate Grant is to get in there. And that's where the momentum is building up. It's a long campaign. The momentum's building up to replace Grant. He's failed. He's tried 4 times to take Vicksburg. He even tried to build a canal to bypass Vicksburg, to get the Mississippi to flow in another direction. And that failed. He tried another canal. It was 300 miles long through Louisiana to bypass it. That failed. So he's got all these water projects, and people in the North are thinking, where are these places? Chickasaw Bayou and all these, weirdly named places. Just like Vietnam, we were in Vietnam. Nobody knew what we were doing over there. The soldiers, anyway, we didn't know. But it's eventually a situation where he has to send down a spy, Charles Dana from the War Department, who had been a famous war newspaper man, to spy on Grant to see if he was drinking, because there were reports he was an alcoholic. He did drink during the Vicksburg campaign. Was drinking affecting his behavior, and was he competent? And Dana fell in love with Grant and thought he was terrific. And the one incident that Grant embarrassed himself and went crazy drunk, a real bender, Dana didn't report it. Disobeyed orders to report everything and didn't write back to Lincoln, and stayed with Grant for the rest of the war, right to Appomattox. So if he'd have fought that war, the Mississippi campaign in the East, where there are all these reporters, war correspondents right on the spot, Lincoln is right there in Washington, right across the river from Lee's plantation in Alexandria, he'd have been gone. He'd have been gone the way of Burnside and Hooker and all the others. But Lincoln stuck with it, won victories, but he also, could have been replaced.
Yeah. From the start of his first campaign, he had a conflict with his subordinate McClernand that seemed to develop throughout the entire length of the Vicksburg campaign. Well,
that's a really interesting side story that, again, I wasn't aware of, to the extent that that it could have disrupted and destroyed the whole campaign. Lincoln was so desperate to take Vicksburg. See, Lincoln's under pressure from the Midwest, from farmers who used to send all their products down through New Orleans, their grain and corn and things like that. And now they can't get them by Vicksburg. So there's all this political pressure from Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa. There's talk of forming a Northwest Confederacy to join the Southern Confederacy and secede from the Union. So Lincoln wants to open that river, and Grant's making slow progress. So one of his commanders, the fellow you mentioned, McPherson, this bombastic Illinois politician, had a lot of swag and a lot of influence with Northern Democrats. Lincoln needed Democrats as well as Republicans. They called them war Democrats to support the war. McPherson goes personally to the president, and because Lincoln considered his influence important, he gets Lincoln to give him an army to go down and capture Vicksburg, and doesn't tell Grant, who's already invading Mississippi. He's in Mississippi. And long story short, it's a funny thing, but it's really, could have been, a magnificent foul up. They start sending troops down to Memphis. Lincoln does, and his Secretary of War, Stanton. And they send them to Memphis. And Henry Halleck, who's, General-in-Chief in Washington, D.C., who had been an opponent of Grant for years, had him arrested, in fact, when Grant served under him for disobeying orders. He doesn't like McPherson because he's not West Point. And all these West Point guys had this thing about West Point. So he sneaks information to Grant that McPherson's been given approval, and he does it in a muted way, that he's been given approval to invade Mississippi, and they're sending troops down to Memphis. So Halleck says, why don't you go over there and take his troops? And Grant sends Sherman over to Memphis. He takes all the troops sent to Memphis for McPherson and takes them down to Vicksburg and invades Vicksburg and gets his ass beat down there pretty badly. But the funny thing is, when McPherson shows up, he was late getting together with his army because he was marrying his widowed wife's sister, and a lot younger, and didn't get there until after the wedding. There's nobody on the docks. There's no army. There's nobody there. So he takes a boat down to Vicksburg himself and takes over command of the army for a couple of days before Grant replaces him. But yeah, imagine the foul up. You think of Lincoln as being a pretty shrewd strategist and an old-fashioned good country lawyer, but to do something like this, to send two commanders into the same district, and neither of them knew about the other one, man, that could have been a real foul up. But that's a sub-story in the book. It's building throughout this thing.
Absolutely. So, and that was really centered around Grant's first campaign, in which he's almost encountering McPherson, and then the second is when Sherman is moving by way of the Yazoo River toward the Chickasaw Bayou.
Yeah.
You talk about in the book how while it was a slog and there was heavy losses there, that Sherman believed if he had kept pushing, he would have gotten through.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, he did, and but it's a complicated campaign. But what he does is he comes down from Memphis with a fleet. Sherman does, and this is the Yazoo area here. That's that Steel Bayou's expedition. That were near Rolling Fork there. You see Porter's ironclad stopped by rebels. That's where that occurs. And I don't know if you can get me to another map there, James, that has Memphis on it in the first campaign. That'll do. So if you go up to the top of the map to Memphis, in the Memphis area, Grant's in Tennessee. The Yankees have conquered Tennessee in the winter of '62, And Grant's gonna come down along the railroad to the right there toward College Hill and Oxford, where the University of Mississippi is today. They follow the railroad and they meet there. Sherman comes from Memphis and Grant comes from these little towns, these junction towns, Grand Junction and the other adjacent town. And they meet there, and that's where they learn about McClernand. So the next arrow goes up to Memphis, and that's where Grant says, look, you take a corps, part of your corps, and go up to Memphis, pick up those troops, leave for the Yazoo on December 20th. Porter comes downriver, hears about this, and joins Sherman. They meet for the first time in Memphis, and he says, I'll escort your troop ships down the river. And they go all the way down the river, past Arkansas Post, all the way down to Mississippi, and they get to just above Vicksburg. And they go in a little river called the Yazoo River, just above Vicksburg, to a place called Chickasaw Bayou. Now that's a long river journey, and the Confederates have scouts and guerrillas operating all along the river. So they know they're coming. They know they're coming. And it's Christmas. In fact, to this day in Vicksburg, by the way, they're still fighting the Civil War in Vicksburg, and they win. But in Vicksburg on Christmas Eve, they have a ball, and just like the ball they held at this day on Christmas Eve, and it's broken up when a scout from across the river has picked up word by telegraph that the Yankees are coming, and the ball disperses, and people go back to their homes, and the soldiers go to their guns at Chickasaw Bayou, which is a nasty little swamp behind Vicksburg in a place called the Walnut Hills, and these high hills that protect Vicksburg from the swamp, from the miasma of the swamp. The Confederates are dug in, they're outnumbered, and Sherman tries to assault the bluffs and get into Vicksburg like that, and he's slaughtered. Now, what he thought was going to happen was that Grant was going to meet him there and be a pincer movement. Grant would continue from Oxford all the way down through the Delta and meet him there. But what happened to Grant, and Sherman didn't know this, there's no telegraphic communication. The rebel army under a guy named General Van Dorn looped around and got in Grant's rear and destroyed his supply station at Holly Springs. And then further north, the famous Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalrymen destroyed the telegraph lines and railroads that connected Grant all the way up to Cairo and his supply lines. So Grant's cut off from his supply lines and has to turn around, and it's with great humiliation that he marches out of Mississippi and goes back to Memphis. And only when he reaches Memphis does he get word, and not for a couple of days, that Sherman's been beaten badly. And this is New Year's Day, 1861, and 1863. And it looks like the Vicksburg campaign is over, except Grant has one thing: persistence, tremendous resolve. And he reassembles the army in Memphis, tells Sherman to wait for him down there on the Louisiana side of the river. And by the end of January, he's back into the fight. And from Louisiana, he has to figure out a way to take Vicksburg. And that's when the bodies start floating in the river, and that's the Valley Forge of the campaign. And that's where he has the conundrum of how he's going to get inside the city. So it's a complicated campaign. I think it's one reason why some people stay away from it. How do you read something this complicated? I tried to explain this as excitingly and as clearly as I can, and so that you don't just confound the reader with all these crazy names like Tallahatchie and and Chickasaw and things like that. But that's the first Vicksburg campaign of '62. Second, actually, the Navy campaign. New Orleans is first, then Grant, and now the second, the big campaign, where starting in January, when the Army, the floodwaters go down, the Army's in better shape. He marches from Milliken's Bend. You see March 31st. He heads out from, that's his camp in Louisiana. You see the Mississippi's not a straight river. It goes where it wants to go. And sends Porter with his gunboats by the Vicksburg batteries. And the army marches through this flooded area. That's why they're zigging and zagging. They're just looking for dry land, mostly marching on top of levees. Takes them a full month to get all the way down to the bottom of the slide at Bruinsburg. When then the gunboats get through and meet them at Bruinsburg. And now they're going to cross the river. This is D-Day of the Civil War, okay, April 1st, 1863. The army crosses, bands playing, everything, and they land on rebel soil in Mississippi. And luckily, there's nobody there because Grant has, I won't get into this, performed a number of terrifically intriguing diversionary movements where he's miles and days ahead of his Confederate commanders in Mississippi. He lands at Bruinsburg. He goes inland to Port Gibson. See that town there? That's just below Vicksburg. And he surprises them. The commander of Vicksburg, this is part of this interesting part of the story. He's from Philly. He's from Philadelphia, an old Quaker family in Philadelphia, the Pemberton family. And I'm speaking at the Philadelphia Club at the end of the month, Zoom-like. And the Pemberton family were members of the club. But this is what happened. And he gets to Port Gibson. Instead of going straight up to Vicksburg, he goes east. And because he's heard that there's an army over on the right there at a town called Jackson, which is the capital of Mississippi. And he's marching here to Raymond, wins a battle there. See, there's an army inside Vicksburg defending it, and there's a relief army of reinforcements out in Jackson. Grant's outnumbered. He's on enemy soil. He's cut his communications with DC. He loved that. He didn't want to be controlled by Lincoln or anybody else. Cuts his telegraph lines, establishes a supply base to support his army for a while with ships coming down from Milliken's Bend, marches inland, and wins a quick succession. He's moving so quickly, he doesn't even set up hospital facilities for his men. The guys got scared before they crossed the river. They said, well, where are the hospitals, the hospital wagons? Well, there were none. And so he counted on the Confederates taking care of his wounded and burying his dead. And he moves from Port Gibson all the way up and takes Jackson, Mississippi, all the way across the map there, and scatters the army of Joseph Johnson that's there. And now he moves back east along the railroad, back west, I should say, along the railroad, and goes straight at Vicksburg. The army inside Vicksburg finally comes out to meet him, and they fight what Winston Churchill called the most important battle of the Civil War, and a place called Champion Hill. And Champion Hill is the plantation of a guy named Sid Champion. It's a one-day fight, and it's a horribly destructive battle, very bloody battle. And they chase the Vicksburg army right back into the city, and they besiege them. And this is the beginning of a 47-day siege. And Porter has his gunboats out on the river. You can see the siege line surrounding the city like that. And from South Fort to Square Fort, those are all Confederate forts. And this battlefield is all preserved today. You can go down there and walk around it. It's a great battlefield, especially with the views of the river and things like that. And there aren't any major battles during the siege. They try to dig their way into the city. They try to go under some Confederate forts and they blow one up. But they really don't get inside the city. And they win in a number of ways. They win by starving them out. They're eating mule meat and muskrats, not real rats, muskrats, There's a lot of women inside Vicksburg. Grant seals the city up. He doesn't allow an evacuation. And they bombard it by day, and they bombard it by night. And they bombard it with 200-pound, that's how large the shell was, 200-pound siege mortars that fire these tremendously heavy shells into the air. And they land on Vicksburg homes and streets. And so the women of Vicksburg live part of their days and most of their evenings inside caves that are built into the side of the hills of Vicksburg. And that prevented a calamity of major proportions with a lot of the population killed. So casualties were minimal in the city. I found that out because nobody had done a count on it. And I thought, how am I going to figure this out? And I thought, I was talking to a guy in the archives, and he says, we have the funeral records. And everybody who was killed inside the city had a funeral. So I got all the 6 funeral homes in Vicksburg. I got their records and I counted the number, and there weren't that many. There were under 12 that were killed in the city. But hellacious living under the bombs and starving like that. And eventually it gets to the point where the army can't hold out anymore. And the commander, John Pemberton, under tremendous pressure, not to surrender. A lot of these Vicksburg soldiers, they fight heroically if for a lousy cause. They're out there. The Yankees, see, once they surround Vicksburg, the irony is the longer Vicksburg holds out, the worse it is for the Confederacy, because Grant can build up his army. And with, the Mississippi's now his supply line, and he can go up the Yazoo River and dump his supplies and soldiers there. And he can build his army up to near 90,000 men. Nurses come in, doctors come in, parents visit soldiers. The Confederates, on the other hand, are under a circle of fire. And those boys had to fight every day on their and sleep on their guns. And they had to withstand storms and and tornadoes, not hurricanes, tornadoes. And they were worn down. 90% of them, at least, everybody had dysentery. But they still want to fight. But the commanders finally take a boat, and they thought for a long time that Jefferson Davis would save them. I mean, this was his home city. His plantation was just below Vicksburg. That's the one I said that Grant took over. He and his brother built the area, as it were. And Davis did come out to Vicksburg and gave some stirring speeches at the state capitol while Grant was still in Mississippi. But they wanted him to take control, actually command, and he was a brilliant commander during the Mexican War, take control of the armies and remove Pemberton, who was always suspected for being a Yankee traitor, that turned the city over surreptitiously to his cohorts in Philadelphia, from the north. But take over the army, and he would never allow Vicksburg to fall. But they're too tied up. And they asked Robert E. Lee, just before he went to Gettysburg, to Pennsylvania, to Maryland, Pennsylvania. There were quite a few, Davis among them, legislators in Richmond who said, we want to send Lee out to save Vicksburg. And Lee refused to go. He said that the summer climate will kill the Yankees with their woolen uniforms, just like it did with the Navy the year before. He said, disease beat them before, disease will beat them again. He wanted a piece of Pennsylvania. So he marches north toward Gettysburg, and these two places surrendered within a day of each other. The day after Gettysburg, the day after as Lee's leaving Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrenders. So these two tremendously important battles reach a culmination point, within 24 hours of one another. Yeah. And the significance of this is, well, the river's open from St. Louis to New Orleans, and it's a Yankee river. Union gunboats, transports can use the river to go anywhere they want. The South is cut in two. that whole area, Baton Rouge and Port, that whole area to the west of the Mississippi, Louisiana, great parts of it, Arkansas, Texas, parts of Missouri, it's cut off. It's the Western Confederacy, and a lot of beef cattle, smuggled guns coming in from Galveston, Texas, all kinds of molasses, salt, which is absolutely needed to preserve food, had come across the Mississippi and into Vicksburg, and by train from Vicksburg to the rest of the Confederacy. That ain't no more. And he captures, Grant does, an entire army of 30,000 guys. So he's taken the guts out of the, you know, and this is the heart of the Cotton Country. These are the first big battles fought in Cotton Country. And it won't be long before Sherman's marching to Meridian and finishing up Mississippi as a cotton state, and then marching from Chattanooga to Atlanta, Atlanta to Savannah, and Savannah, of course, all the way up to meet Grant in Virginia. So it's a tremendously important thing. Yeah.
I think a quote that you use on page 140 really solidifies the idea that you were weaving throughout the entire time and throughout the entire book. The quote you used, "The richest land in Mississippi," was in reference to Vicksburg and the Mississippi Valley. "The richest land in Mississippi was webbed by roads and waterways, and Vicksburg was at the center of the web." As you mentioned, you know, the Vicksburg and
it is.
Shreveport
It is at the center of the web. And you know, the remark I made, which I didn't complete, about the longer they held on, the worse it got, because Grant's army is a marauding army also. You can only put 10,000, 11,000 guys on siege duty by the day. What's the rest of the army going to do? Well, Grant had them pillaging all over the place to cut off Vicksburg supplies, like north of the city, up near Grenada and places like that. Very rich area in cotton production, and also cattle and foodstuffs, wheat and grain, which they grew in Mississippi. They went to grain products, you know. And they're destroying the agriculture infrastructure of Mississippi so that Vicksburg can't be supplied. So this is 19th century version of total warfare, where you're warring on the civilians as well. You're not killing civilians, but you're warring on the citizenry. They become part of the war. Their houses, their plantation homes, their cattle, and they themselves have to leave in this massive exodus. So you're really fighting an army, and you're fighting an economy. And we tried to do this to Germany and did it well and did it effectively against Japan with air power, but in World War II. But Grant, you know, inaugurates that style of warfare. And I think that's the big takeaway from Vicksburg. Yeah, there's all those big things about the surrender, you know, and the freeing of the slaves, the liberation of the army. But Grant is the man at this point. He's the general, and he's going to be brought east shortly to become commander-in-chief of all American armies. And the Confederates did not call themselves Americans. And he brings with him a style of warfare that he inaugurated in the Mississippi Valley. And it's a style of warfare we often associate with William Tecumseh Sherman and with his march to the sea, the scourge of the South. Well, Grant was a real man of iron. He taught Sherman how to fight that way. And that's how they fought in Virginia. And through grinding attrition, coordinated warfare, all the armies working together, destroying land, taking slaves, and just trying to beat down the enemy army, relentless day-to-day warfare. That was the big thing about Vicksburg. It really, you know, was scared, you know, the South. They knew with Grant was going to become Grant style of warfare. Yeah.
You could say they learned what it would take to defeat the South. The the
They did.
actual,
He learned how to beat them.
yeah.
He learned how to take down Dixie, and this is how you do it, and this is how it was done. And it took a year more. So how can you say this is the most decisive battle? Well, it's the most decisive battle because of what was won, but also the way it was fought is carried over and becomes Union general military strategy for the rest of the war. Where Gettysburg, tremendously important battle, of course, if Lee wins, but he doesn't win. And somebody once said, well, I would get a lot of questions from students. Well, what if Lee had won? I said, let's take that. Where's he going to go? Maybe Harrisburg, maybe. He ain't going to Philadelphia. That wasn't in his plan. He's certainly not going to Washington. That wasn't in his plan. That might be in a book by Newt Gingrich, but it's not real history. And he didn't have the supply line. He couldn't have stayed afloat. His army couldn't have supported itself in Pennsylvania. And you might beat a Yankee army of 100,000, but you're not going to annihilate it. And Meade would have been reinforced. Another commander would have been, if Meade had lost, another commander would have been put in, probably Grant. And the war might have even been over a little earlier. The thing about Gettysburg is Grant gets away. Meade doesn't pursue him. And Lincoln was extremely upset by that. He didn't see Gettysburg as a complete victory because Meade let Lee cross the Potomac and get back to Virginia. And by September, his army was bigger than it was when it went to Vicksburg, when it went into Pennsylvania. So that they recovered very fast and win some pretty important victories as well. If you consider battles like the Wilderness victories, slaughterfest. But yeah, that army's pretty strong again. And when you go into the letters of the citizenry, and especially in the Virginia area, they had such a belief in the invincibility of Lee that they never really saw Gettysburg for the loss that it was. He'll recover. The argument was he didn't take that bad a beating. They just had more numbers than we did. Now they're going to come down here and fight near Richmond on our home territory, and we'll take them. They weren't as upset. They were very upset by Vicksburg because of all that had been lost. And the war was coming, that style of war was coming their way, like a slow building Western storm. And Sherman turned out to be that storm. Grant pins Lee down at Richmond, and Sherman goes ripping through Georgia and up through the Carolinas, and that's the end of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a pretty important battle in that respect.
Not to mention Vicksburg being on the Confederate home front, deep in the South, far away from friendly territory.
Yeah, exactly. Davis always believed, lingeringly, he continued to believe this with Sherman too, that he could beat him, but it was a pipe dream by that time. But they never thought Grant would get this far into the, into the guts of the South. I mean, really into the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, and so they've lost so much here, especially with New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy, the major port in the Confederacy, things like that. It all starts to tumble. What happens after Vicksburg is the South can still win the Civil War. They can win it, but they can't win it on the battlefield. They can win it if they can hold on. This is exactly how the Japanese thought in World War II after we took Iwo Jima. And after we took Saipan and began to base B-29 bombers there and bomb the empire, Tokyo and places like that. They had lost the war, but if they could bleed the Americans enough at places like Peleliu and Okinawa and Iwo Jima, they could destroy morale on the home front to the point where let's pull out of this thing. It's not worth it, and negotiate a settlement. We've already beat Nazi Germany, and maybe we're in May of 45. That's the last Japanese hope. And the last Confederate hope is the election of 1864. If McClellan, the former head of the Army of the Potomac, who was pro-slavery, if McClellan wins, he had already pledged to go to the peace table with the South, not to surrender, but certainly to bring about a peace that would allow slavery to have existed. And Lincoln did think that he was going to lose the election of 64. He wrote a letter to his cabinet and he sealed it. And he brought the sealed envelope in and asked every cabinet member to sign it. Weird thing. They didn't know what was in it. And then he opened it after he won the election. And it said, if I lose, he said, I expect to lose the election. I'm going to work with McClellan in the interregnum between the two presidencies to try to bring the war to a close. But he doesn't lose because Grant and Sherman win, and another general named Sheridan win a number of really critical battles just before the election that swing the war back to the Union. And those battles are, Sherman took Atlanta, hugely important, and started toward the sea. A guy named Phil Sheridan was raising a lot of hell in the Shenandoah Valley and won a succession of victories there. Farragut took Mobile Bay, cut off second largest port next to New Orleans in the South. So it couldn't do any blockade running in the southern regions. The only port left to them was Wilmington, North Carolina, which Sherman eventually took. So those victories just before the election, that if McClellan wins, they can get a negotiated. That's the only way they can win it at this point. So Vicksburg decisive in the sense that they can't win it. They'll never again, the South after Vicksburg, mount an offensive operation. Yeah, a major offensive operation. No more Gettysburgs, no more Chancellorsville, no more Fredericksburgs, etc. Yeah. So a lot of that stuff, James, I found with the help of you guys. I had a very loyal group of Excel scholars that this man joined. I had Jason Hill, and who was terrific. He's majoring in astrophysics, and it's like James. He's a Renaissance person. We got engineers in astrophysics. Zach Leff, who thought like a scientist. Matt Ryan, who worked with me, great military historian. Emily Koenig, who's working her way up through the State Department, things like that. Elizabeth Lucy, they all worked with me. They didn't go to the archives. You know, we don't have the funding at Lafayette to take kids out to USC and down to Vicksburg and places like that. But some of them worked local archives, Carlisle military barracks and places like that, New York Public Library. They researched newspapers and magazines. Ken Burns said there weren't a lot of illustrations. Well, there are a lot of, pen and ink artists doing things for magazines like Harper's and Leslie's. And they collected those images for me. They did time charts. And when I wrote a chapter, I'd always talk to the students about how we would construct the chapter. And they'd offer their input. And then I'd write the chapter, and then a month later, I'd pass it around to everybody, and each person individually would critique it. And then they'd come into my office, and we'd go over the critique, and everybody had their own critique. And then I'd critique their critique. And we'd work to polish the thing. And they weren't just catching typos. They're my readers. I aim not just for other historians, but for a general reading public. I try to sell books and in stores. And so they're the intelligent reading public. And I want to know if everything's clear. And if something's not clear, they tell me. And they say, it's a little fuzzy here, or you're getting a little too academic here, or you're getting a little too crazy with repetition, or there's too much detail, you're bogging it down. So those kind of voices, to have that available to you is a great resource. And Lafayette is very generous to have the Excel program. It's I taught at a couple of other places, Cornell and Penn and things like that, and we never had anything like that. Even our graduate students mostly didn't do that kind of work unless you forced them to. And they got a bullwhip out to get them not to be working on their dissertation, to be working for you. But this worked out great with the Excel students. And James jumped right in there, right out of the freshman seminar. I kind of recruited him, asked him to join, and he was always vacillating. And he'd tell me about, he knew he had a really good GPA, knew he was going to get a hell of a job, and he did get a great job in engineering. And then I just got a letter from him a couple of weeks ago and said, man, kind of rethinking things. I think I'm going to go to grad school in history. So I didn't pressure him, but he's back. He's following his heart, right?
Absolutely. It's something I've grappled with my entire academic career and my fledgling professional career.
Yeah.
And, the challenge is, the challenge you have is the availability of jobs, the availability of the academic experiences.
Well, James, it's great because I just wrote a letter for Emily Koenig, and for State Department position. They like that students have done independent research in conjunction with professors who are doing major books. That really appeals to them because that's big kid work. And that's the kind of work that an advanced researcher in the company would do. And they like that they're working with writing and things like that. So they become saleable commodities when they graduate, not just history majors. They have skill sets, and and the college generously and with the help of alumni, have been very helpful to me. Jim Fisher, for example, helped fund some of these kids. They allow me to have 2 or 3 of them so they can work, which is really fun for them to work as a team, where they're working as a group of 3. I sometimes even had 4. And that was great to have the luxury of that and have the kids meet on their own and discuss the stuff and share information, decide what areas they want to emphasize and things like that. So
and we quickly learned that we needed each other in terms of, anyone who gets a copy of the book will see that the last 150 pages are a variety of notes, the bibliography, various additions that are not included directly in the text. And one of our larger jobs was helping Dr. Miller organize that and keep track of those citations. And with a book as thoroughly researched as Vicksburg, you have hundreds and hundreds of citations to keep track of, and they're referenced each a number of times in the book. So it's a very, we formed a good bond and got great applied experience along the way.
It's painstaking work. I forget who it was, I once asked one of my students what they got out of it, and they said, well, my takeaway is I would never write a book. It's a real pain in the neck, and all the detail work, because you think you just write it and send it off to the publisher, but there's so much work after that. You just take one of these maps, and the students help me with the maps. The publisher will send you a template, but you have to put in all those spots. Now, you'll send it to a map maker to fancy it up and make sure the geography is right. But you have to put on there the exact places that you're going to deal with and the exact points where they are. And then the students can fact check and have you fact check the maps, which is pretty arduous kind of duty to do. So they're doing a variety of things that are really very helpful, very helpful.
Absolutely. So I think just to put a bow on this, I'd like to just wrap up Grant's story arc, if you will,
Yeah.
in your book. So he begins, as you said, he's a failed businessman, really a hapless drunk at times. He later becomes a war hero and eventually the president of the country. I guess how would you characterize the legacy that he leaves and as it continues to
Well,
evolve?
you know, there's another Grant legacy here. I mean, Grant the writer. Um, he was hoodwinked by a swindler. Um, I work with, when I work with Ken Burns, I work with Jeff Ward, who writes all of Ken Burns's books with him. Okay, and Ken does the Civil War, Jeff and Ken write the book. And Jeff's great-grandfather is the guy that swindled Grant. And I learned that when we were doing a film on Abraham and Mary Lincoln with David Rubin for the American Experience. And kids help, by the way, with the film work too. They've got good jobs in the film business. We have a lot of kids, Excel students that went on to the film work. Some are doing really well, and as producers. But anyway, the Grant story, he loses everything. His son tells him one day that this stuff had been invested in a Ponzi scheme, basically. And all the money was gone. It's all Grant's retirement money. So Grant had been getting offers to write articles for magazines on his life, and someone suggested that he write his memoirs. And he got a contract, and then Mark Twain, of all people, who was a great Grant admirer, he used to say that getting together with Grant was like having pork and beans with Julius Caesar. It was a big deal. And he said, look, I'm going to form a publishing company and we'll sell this by subscription. That is, we'll get old Army veterans who served under Grant to go house to house and sell this like old encyclopedia salesmen. But the problem is Grant going to be able to write it? Because as soon as he starts writing it, he loved fruit and he bites down on a peach to the hard core and doesn't break a tooth, but he has this incredible shooting pain that went through his whole upper body. And he had cancer of the mouth and tongue. And it was, you know, it was terminal. And is he going to be able to write this thing and complete it and save his family? The embarrassment of bankruptcy. Well, he does. He goes to a cottage for the last part of it. I used to go up there a lot because I like the racetrack in Saratoga and the ponies. And there's a beautiful little cabin up there that Grant wrote this in. You can visit it, Grant's cabin, just above Saratoga. It's pristine. It's out in the middle of the woods. And Grant, in good weather, there's a famous picture of him sitting on the porch all wrapped up in a scarf around his neck and things. And he's proofreading the final pages of it. And it's not rushed either. It's a measured pace throughout. And he died days after he completed the book, which became a sensational bestseller. And a book that the writer Gore Vidal, for example, considered one of the 100 best books ever written by an American. Sherman also was a very good writer, and his memoirs are published by the Library of America. So there's Grant that way, and the Grant style of warfare, of using heavy numbers of men and machinery, is used, but it's actually Grant as a strategist. He wasn't casualty averse. He was willing to take casualties, but he preferred not to. Vicksburg, the Union loses about 10,000 guys. Well, he lost 3 times as many at Gettysburg in one battle. And he goes into a siege situation there and at Petersburg. Petersburg, below Richmond, he went into a siege for an entire year to cut down on casualties and to defeat the enemy by economic strangulation. And it's the variety of types of warfare that he pioneers that I think carries over and is taught at places like West Point and things like that. And it's just it's a terrific story too, because it's just so American a story, you know. I mean, it's you know, this Ohio family. His dad's a tanner. You know, there's nobody distinguished in the family. He didn't want to go to West Point. He wanted to be a mathematician at a small liberal arts college. I mean, so many twists and turns in his life. He's just such an interesting character in that regard. And his honesty is what gets you, and his integrity. He wasn't brilliant. He was resolute. He knew geography. He was a great horseman. He knew terrain. He made smart decisions. He was quiet. He was almost undefeatable in the sense of, I think his battle with liquor. My father was an alcoholic, and I gave him this book to read, and it helped him a lot. And he used to pass it around to Alcoholics Anonymous gatherings and things about how Grant drank throughout his life, but he beat it slowly through a kind of attritional battle with that as well. So he's fighting that personal battle against poverty, and then he's fighting a personal battle against the booze, and then he's fighting, you know, reputational battles and things like that. So it's a story of persistence and the kind of the little engine that could. Yeah.
Terrific. His whole career was.
Yeah. So I can't get away from him. And I'm doing my next book on the last year of the war, when he formed a partnership with Lincoln that eventually wins the war, and get into that election of '64 and the things I glancingly described before. So I'm back to that with a lot of fresh in. And it turns out he wasn't as good a general at the end, because he didn't have Sherman, he didn't have McPherson, another top commander, he didn't have Porter, but more importantly, he had an army that had low morale, that had been beaten and beaten again, the Army of the Potomac. And he just didn't have the kind of army he had that took Vicksburg.
Don, I'm gonna pipe in here because we're getting near the end of our time, and there's a couple of questions in the chat that I was hoping that you could address.
Sure.
We have Jim Hockenberry, class of '74. He asks, could a different Confederate general have defeated Grant's Vicksburg campaign?
Maybe in the beginning. Pemberton wasn't much. And when Grant went east to fight Lee, that's what all of General Meade's Army of the Potomac commanders said. Well, Generals Bragg, Pemberton, and that gang, Joseph Johnson out west, that is an R.E. Lee and you know, Longstreet. Maybe initially in Mississippi, but I don't think over time. I mean, he does defeat Lee eventually. I mean, that's the best they throw at him, and he beats him. The battles are, the first three fights he has with Lee, the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, and at Cold Harbor, are almost draws. I would say Cold Harbor, you know, Lee beats him up a little bit, but then he outmaneuvers Lee. I don't want to get too much into this, and completely baffles him. I was reading a couple of accounts by Lee's commanders, and they said by the end of the war, one of them was Lee's chief artillery commander, and he says at the end of the war that Grant just ran circles around Lee in the end, and as a strategist. So I think he is, you know, the consummate commander of the war. Yeah, the guy that would have really given him a fight would have been, I think, Jackson, the best of the Southern commanders, Stonewall Jackson. Yeah, but luckily Grant didn't have to bang heads with him. It's a great question.
We have another question that actually kind of feeds into the whole strategist. From Ed Vanyo, class of '86. Did Grant more or less invent this style of total warfare, or was he influenced by other strategists?
No, Grant didn't. He didn't like what he called theoretical warfare. Sherman was a great reader of military history. So was Halleck, who had written a number of books about Prussian military commanders. And this stuff was taught at West Point, but Grant didn't take much interest in it. At West Point, he was interested in painting and drawing and horseback riding and reading novels. He didn't read a book on military strategy in his life. So he didn't believe in book warfare, and he believed in meeting the enemy. And that's where he sometimes made mistakes. He would meet the enemy, instantly assess the enemy's strengths and weaknesses and go straight at him. And sometimes, like at Fort Donelson, he got surprised. And Shiloh, he got surprised by underestimating the strength and perspicacity, whatever that word means, the strength of the and skill and keenness of opposing generals. I don't think when he first takes command, he'd only been a captain before he was cashiered out of the military. When he first takes command, he's not the general that he was when he finally took Vicksburg. You get these people that write to Amazon with reviews, and somebody says, well, there's a lot of foreshadowing in this book, a lot of stuff before Vicksburg, but that's deliberate because Grant planned the campaign very early on. And I thought, as Grant becomes better, Vicksburg slowly becomes more important. See, it isn't an important place at the start of the war because the Confederacy has other ports along the river. Forts Donelson and Henry and Memphis and New Orleans. As they fall, Vicksburg rises in importance. And as Grant wins a succession of victories, he rises in importance. So you got the supreme kind of World Series going on here, in 63, the toughest nut to crack, Vicksburg, and the commander who looks like he's the guy who might be able to do it. So it becomes, the book builds its momentum like that. Vicksburg getting ever stronger, and it does. After that, the Navy fails to take Vicksburg. Vicksburg rebuilds its fortifications on the land side very heavily, in addition to the Mississippi side. So it's a stronger garrison, but Grant's a more seasoned commander. Yeah. These are good questions.
We have 2 more questions. These 2 are from Conrad Williams, class of 71.
Mm-hmm.
First question, would you comment on the criticism Grant took about his high casualty rate? And number 2, would you comment on the role of African-American troops in the campaign? That might be require a
Well, African-American troops don't play a central role in the command until later on. I mean, Grant recruits African-American troops and uses them as for guard duty. When he crossed the Mississippi into Louisiana, he left behind at Milliken's Bend, it was his major supply station. And it was guarded primarily by Black troops. And the Confederates raided it and tried to take it. And the Blacks who fought there had less than a week of training, but they fought heroically. Some of them had never fired a gun before the battle, a rifle. And the Navy helped enormously. Porter came in with his gunboats and helped to scatter them. So that is the first time Black troops are in a major engagement in the Civil War. And then after Vicksburg falls, the city is defended as a garrison town mostly by Black troops, and that really offended the Vicksburg people. And then Blacks, of course, become major parts of Grant's Army of the Potomac, and they served under General Burnside and fought at a big battle called the Battle of the Crater, where they were trapped in a crater that they'd blown up a Confederate fort, created a gigantic hole in the ground. Blacks were caught in there, and it became a racial fight, actually, as Southerners tried to go in there and kill Blacks. Yeah, they do play an important part in the in the war. Now, Grant, what was the first question? The first part of the question?
First question was, would you comment on the criticism Grant took about his
casualties? Well, he doesn't take a lot of criticism because he doesn't take a lot of casualties in the Vicksburg campaign. But he starts to take a lot of criticism around the time of Cold Harbor. And not only by the public, he lost in less than a month 50,000 men, and the wounded and the dead are being taken back by boat to Washington and buried in Washington at Arlington Cemetery. It became Arlington Cemetery, Lee's former plantation. They're buried right on his front door, purposely. And they're filling the hospitals up. And Lincoln is sick about this. And he was criticized by his own staff, his chief of staff, John Rawlins, and one of his former staff, James Wilson, a cavalry leader, and Dana, who was a spy for the government. By Cold Harbor, they're urging Grant not to go. So what he would do is, Lee didn't have the punch to fight offensively. So every time he tangled with Grant, he would entrench behind earthen and wood fortifications, timber fortifications, and Grant would attack straight on. And in the Civil War, 9 out of 10 armies that fought on the defense won. So these guys are getting slaughtered, and a lot of them start to lose their minds, but also lose their hope for victory and lose their faith in Grant. And Grant does come in for a heck of a lot of criticism. I just read an account today by a guy named Upton, who led 2 of the charges at Spotsylvania, one of the worst of these slaughter fests, and criticizing Grant for attacking incessantly, just trying to use numbers to wear down the Confederates. But Lee was taking the same amount of numbers. When you do this proportionally, his losses proportionate to the size of his army are as great as Grant's. So even though he's fighting on the defensive, but Grant was heavily criticized for this, absolutely.
I have another question. This is from Fred Moore. Would you say Grant's greatest attribute is he refused to lose and refused to accept defeat?
Absolutely. I don't know what I could add to that. I mean, he just did, and everybody who was around him talked about that. I'll give you one vivid illustration. I mean, he got roughed up pretty badly when he crossed a river called the Rapidan. He's commander-in-chief of all armies, and now here it goes, the Titanic struggle. Okay, and they're going to go down and they're going to take Richmond and beat Lee, and they're going to end the war. Okay, it's spring of 1864. This is it. Grant's come east, and he's going to do it. He crosses the Rapidan. Nothing happens the first day. The second day, he gets caught in a flank movement by Lee and really gets beat up badly. So badly that 2 of his staff said he went to his tent and actually had a breakdown. Recovered quickly, but he had a breakdown where he was sobbing. And but 2 days later when the battle's over, a day later when the battle's over, word goes out that they're going to march at night. And everybody in that army of the Potomac, these guys had been down in Virginia and gotten beaten at Second Bull Run. They got beat at Chancellorsville, et cetera, et cetera. They got beat at Fredericksburg. There are a lot of veterans, and they expected to go back to the Rapidan and back to Washington. And at a juncture in the road at Chancellorsville, where they had suffered one of their worst defeats to Robert E. Lee, instead of turning north, Grant's horse, he pulled his horse south, and the cheering that went through the army was just spine-tingling. The men wanted to fight. They didn't want to go back. They didn't want to go back in ignominy. And, lick him again. It's like the Shiloh campaign, lick him in the morning. He's going to go south, and it's this stubborn resolve, this doggedness that really characterizes him all his life. I mean, he fought to get everything he ever had in his life, and he's not going to lose this war. Yeah, that's a big factor, that psychological factor, when your commander has that kind of persistence.
I have one more question. Why do you think Grant was such an exceptional military commander, yet so inept in all of his other endeavors? This is from Aaron Hoffman.
I have no idea.
Just press it.
And that is the great question about Grant.
Why didn't you press it there?
What is he made for? And Grant is made for war. And if there is no war, Grant sinks into obscurity. And the best he's going to do, I don't know what the best he's going to do, maybe take over the hardware store. That's about it. But he had characteristics that were, there's a famous theory by the philosopher that I studied in grad school, William James, called the man in the moment. Or you can put the human being in the moment. Certain types of individuals emerge and become great because the moment is ready for them. I mean, Jesus Christ is a figure now. If he went preaching like that down at the square at Easton, they arrest him. Okay. Certain figures, though, are born at exactly the right moment where their skills are needed. And Grant's skills were exactly what was needed. He first had the skill to calm people down. He was a very good family man. He was a good father, but he was good around people, and he had a calming influence. And he commanded a regiment that was unruly at the beginning of the war, and he brought discipline to them. He had this quiet kind of confidence at a time when a lot of people in the North thought that the South had all the best generals and all the best military knowledge and more graduates of West Point and a fighting cavalier kind of tradition and everything. And if you will, they were the favorites to win the Civil War, even though the North had the resources. And Grant helped to dispel that with his quiet confidence. And I think those kind of things were absolutely critical in battle. But another thing was his neighbor commented. He said he was a lousy businessman because he refused to take advantage of people. He tried to sell real estate, and he tell people honestly what the property looked like, and he just had this kind of, his integrity almost overwhelmed every other aspect, and he wasn't aggressive enough in those areas of life. So wasn't suited for that sort of stuff. Wasn't that he didn't like money? He loved money, and he was well treated by Gilded Age capitalists who bought him home after home after home. I lived near a Grant mansion down in Long Branch, New Jersey, when I was teaching in that area and commuting to New York. So Grant had houses built for him all over the country by Gilded Age capitalists. So, but I don't think he would have made any, and he was gullible. He tended to trust people who were close to him. And in warfare, when they're fighting for a common cause, you don't get that unless you get a Benedict Arnold or something like that. But when you go out into politics and there's opportunities to get your hand in the honeypot or whatever, a lot of his associates during his presidency took advantage of it. And Grant wasn't personally culpable in any of those scandals. But people said, what about the guys he hired? Well, they were his buddies. They were his war buddies. They're the guys that helped him win the Civil War. And he had this implicit trust in them. And the trust worked. He was the kind of guy who gave an order, and he wouldn't give you the details of the order. The order would be always clearly written. And by the way, the most impressive thing about Ulysses Grant, to me, is reading his papers. Because several times a day, he's writing orders to his commands while he's in the saddle with a tablet. And his penmanship isn't that great, but these orders are crystal clear, absolutely crystal clear. There's no ambiguity about what you're supposed to do. And he was very, very good about that. And he depended on his commanders who he trusted to carry out the details. He'd give them the big objective: take that town. Take it from the Southwest. If they resist, pull out. If they don't, take it. Okay, we can get around it. Those are the general orders. You decide how to do it. And in the West, he had the kind of commanders who could do that. And in the East, in the Army of the Potomac, where there's a lot of distrust of Grant as this Western guy who's taken over an Eastern army, he didn't have that kind of rapport with his commanders, who often disobeyed his orders. So.
Okay. We've got one last question. Jeb, are you on the line?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. What's your question, Jeb?
I think the doctor touched upon this in the beginning, but What really motivated, I'm talking about a volunteer soldier to participate in this horrible war. I mean, was he really concerned about the Union?
Yeah, he was.
I mean, after all, if they divided it, you would have two countries bigger than any country in Europe.
Yeah.
And was he concerned about slavery at that point?
No, not slavery at all. I think one of the hardest things, Jeb, to understand about the Civil War for me was I always understood the motivation for the South. As a Confederate soldier told a Union soldier who caught him, the Union soldier says, "Why are you fighting?" And he said, "Because you're down here." And some of them fought for slavery, but some of them fought because the Union was invading. It's easy to understand the South defending its own territory, but it's harder to understand an ethereal concept like nationalism, patriotism, and unionism. But the Union was new. It's the first republic in the world. There's a tremendous amount of pride in it, songs built up around it. And especially the kids in the Midwest who, like Lincoln, who built the Midwest. They went into towns like Springfield and built them from the ground up. And it was theirs. And now, there's a spoiled slaveocracy who doesn't use free soil labor, and they're going to try to dictate terms to us. And so in his early letters he has an interesting set of letters to his wife was named Julia, and she came from a St. Louis slave owning family. Her father was a self-proclaimed colonel. What he was just a slaveholder. He would never served in the army, but he was a rebel sympathizer. And Grant has a correspondence with him where the colonel points out just what you did. And Grant said that anyone who doesn't, it's time to stand up. If you're not for the Union, you're a traitor. And he says that forcefully in a letter to the colonel, basically calling his father-in-law a traitor. And he said, and he's not fighting for slavery. He admits that. That's the last thing on his mind. He's fighting to, they use the word redeem the South. The Civil War was called the War of Southern Rebellion at the time. And that's how it was seen, as a revolution or rebellion against the government. And those who were leading it were considered universally as traitors. And so it's, we see it a little bit differently today, but at the time, Union meant an awful lot. It certainly meant a lot to Grant, and it was the only reason that he re-enlists in the Army. Maybe deep down, psychologically, and I'm sure of this, it's not a smart guess. It's just, a common sense guess that it's also a chance to advance. I mean, he's going nowhere in Galena, and maybe he can get a captaincy. And throughout the war, he's talks a lot about his pay grade and things like that. And even when he becomes a lieutenant general, the first one since George Washington, they reinstated the rank. He writes back to Julia that this means not just a commission for life, but a salary for life. And so economic security meant an awful lot to Grant, over time. So maybe that's a motivation too.
Well done. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your talk this evening. It was very enlightening. And James, I really appreciate you joining us and having this chat with Professor Miller. It's very enlightening. And I think it's also a fantastic way to see how our students work with the faculty. I do want to let everyone know that we will be sending a survey out to everyone about this. And in that survey, we're also going to ask if you're interested in having Professor Miller autograph a book plate for you, an adhesive book plate for the any books that you have purchased from Professor Miller, particularly the Vicksburg book. So we'll get that in a survey, which will be sent out to you tomorrow. I do also want to let folks know that we have 2 more ConnectEd events coming up. If you're interested, on August 25th, we have another publisher, Caroline Lee, class of 2003, and she will be discussing the facts on fiction and publishing from her perspective. And on September 15th, we have another professor, Professor Mary Armstrong, will be talking about Gendered by Design, the Secret Life of Things. So you can find more information on those and register for them at leopardlink.lafayette.edu. And again, I want to thank James and thanks Professor Miller.
Well, I want to thank James and you know, for getting me up to stuff on the technology on your part. And it's great to reunite with James again. We'll be talking a lot more about graduate school with him. But and I also want to, my God, I look at the time here. We went 2 hours.
Right.
And I'm sorry about that. But the questions were great. And thank you for your patience and for listening. And I enjoyed it. I hope you people out there did. Yeah.
I'm sure they did. We had over 100 folks on tonight and a lot of
great
comments in the chat room. So really appreciate your time. And we're getting a lot of thank you. This was great. Thank you, Professor Miller. So again, thank you so much. And thank you, James, and best of luck in your future endeavors in the world of history.
It was an honor to be included. I appreciate it.
It was great. It was great. Yeah. And by the way, when I talked to Janine, I said, I'd rather do this as an interview. And I said, let's do it with students. And so we got a hold of him late. We just decided to do this late. So he didn't have a lot of prep time. And I told him I didn't want to know any of the questions beforehand. So he was working on the questions all by himself. And so kudos.
It's a finally
a well-rounded, well-trained Lafayette student, you know.
You taught him well.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, we're going to let everyone go for the evening. But again, thanks so much. And we look forward to seeing our alumni and our parents and everyone else come back for our next talk. Just going to pop one thing out to you, John and Jake and Nancy Morris, class of 84. Thank you so much. Brings back your course from the early 80s, social and cultural U.S. history. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I remember them well.
So you have a lot of former students on here.
Yeah, I heard from them before the lecture.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, we're going to end it now on that note, and everyone have a fantastic evening.
Good night.
Take care. Okay.